Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Virtual Church on the 24th of June. Lovely to have you with us. It's a lovely day. It's my mum's birthday today. Did you enjoy our visit from Bishop Allen, the Virtual Church, yesterday? Not sure if you quite twigged that that was actually the 100th edition of Virtual Church, because we began just a few days before lockdown. There were already some people going into isolation at that time. So what an honour to have Bishop Allen as our special guest for the 100th edition yesterday. And I'm sure you'll have found him as engaging and upbeat and encouraging as I did. Well, today we're carrying on with the story of Joseph, not quite so upbeat, also encouraging. If you remember last time, we found him being sold into slavery by his deeply jealous brothers, sold to some Midianites. That's where they lived, also called Ishmaelites, because that was who they were descended from Ishmael. So, and they were on their way to Egypt. And here's what happened next in chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who'd taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he didn't concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Well, that didn't go very well. That was probably the oldest recorded incident of sexual harassment. And over it, Joseph loses his job. When he continues to refuse Potiphar's wife's advances, she accuses him of rape, and her enraged husband, Joseph's master, has him thrown into prison. And that's pretty bad because there was no judicial system. He wasn't tried, there was no hearing, there wasn't a sentence. He'd just offended someone in power, so he was just thrown away and forgotten about. Give thanks for our judicial system and the way in which it at least gives some mercy by setting a limit on how long your punishment will go on for. Joseph had no such limit with his imprisonment. So, while Joseph was there in prison, I'm picking up again from the end of verse 20. So from verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warder. So the warder put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warder paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So I think this is the prison governor rather than one of the warders, isn't it? Because he seems to have charge over everything that goes on in the hospital, in the prison. But my biggest question is, this is success. That's twice it said it now. that God granted Joseph success in everything he did. Just a moment. He's not only been sold into slavery, he's now been thrown into prison, and that's success. Joseph's career seems to have been out of the frying pan into the fire. Well, what's going on here? How can this possibly be granting success? And I think we have to look at this. For me, I look at this in terms of vocation. One of the things I do, as well as being Vicar of Horton and Wraysbury, is I'm the vocations officer for our deanery, our local area. So I have to meet people and try and help them discern what God might be calling them to. Now, unfortunately, we often seem to mean this in terms of, are you called to be a vicar or not? But vocation is a much bigger thing than that. In Joseph's case, there seemed to have been more than one strand to his vocation. I think this is actually true of all of us. So his vocation was to dream. We've seen his dreams earlier, and we will be coming across them again, to see dreams and visions, but also to lead. And so he is a success in terms of ending up in leadership wherever he goes. So he goes down to Egypt, he's sold as a slave, but he quickly is put in charge. His vocation to be in charge. And then he's thrown into prison, and quickly he's put in charge of everything in the prison. So he's anything but a success in terms of our normal expectations, but he's starting to succeed in God's terms because he's beginning to fulfill what God has put inside him. Vocation is a complex thing. It's not just a voice telling you to do this or to do that, although that certainly can happen, occasionally does happen. It's not just a dream about what God might want you to do, although that happened in Joseph's case, and God still does speak from time to time in our dreams. But it's more earth than that because it's embedded in the kind of person you are. What has God put inside you? What's your personality? What are your aspirations? What are your talents and your gifts? So it's part of the way God has made you. That's really the heart of your vocation. If we look at a list of vocations or gifts from Romans chapter 12, in there it talks about gifts such as serving others, giving, leading. If your gift is to lead, do it diligently, prophesying, speaking out, doing acts of kindness. There's all kinds of vocations that we can have. And those are things that are connected with who God made us to be. Therefore, because each one of us has a unique personality and unique gifts, then each one of us has a different vocation, a different way of expressing that personality, that potential that's inside us. So human fulfillment consists in, not entirely in, that there's really important things about discovering who we are as God's children before we do anything, but it includes discovering our calling and starting to exercise it, because that calling is the expression of who we really are, who God has made us to be. So our vocation is about how God is at work in us, what he intended when he made us that unique person. And as we are made in the image of God, our unique personalities and gifts are reflections in miniature of some aspect of the divine character. Does God show mercy and do acts of kindness? Of course he does. So if that's our calling, we're reflecting some aspect of who he is. Does God give generously? Didn't even withhold his own son. So if we're called to give generously, then we're reflecting something about who God is. Does God lead? Well, he's sovereign. He's the Lord of Lords. If our calling is to leadership, then we need to exercise that as part of who God has made us to be, and the way God's nature is imaged in us. And then God, when we exercise our ministry, uses our unique calling to teach us to grow to be more like him. And that is what's happening to Joseph here. That's the success that God is giving him. Not always an outward success, because to get that outward success truly, we have to have an inward success first. My struggles, problems, and difficulties in ministry, to the greatest extent, have been the things gone on in here. Having to battle with self-doubt and self-pity and wondering what's going wrong, and if God loves me, surely he would do this in my ministry and do that and grant me this and grant me that. Those battles are the hardest ones, the ones inside. And Joseph may be a slave. He is in prison, but he can still be a success in God's eyes, because he's learning to exercise the unique gifts that God has put in him. And just maybe, as he discovers his calling and exercises it, even in these terrible circumstances, God's at work to change his character, to take away that selfishness that was just about getting one over his brothers and saying, I've been given these gifts for my own glory. So often in the Christian life, we don't find our true vocation until we surrender it fully to God, until we discover, by giving it back to the God who gave it in the first place, that pattern of cross and resurrection, which is the template of Christian life. So what about you? Well, we've had a bit of a lockdown. It doesn't really compare to what happened to Joseph in prison. How can we exercise our calling? Because we all have one. How can we surrender that calling to God, to let him make the most of it, to see that it is about rediscovering who we are and how God is at work in us, and not about some exercise in self-glorification. Let's bring those matters to God in prayer. Success. How could it be a success for Joseph to end up being thrown into prison? Well, here we are, Lord, in our own pandemic situation. Please help us to see how we can make a success of our times and our difficulties, and see, even in such strange circumstances, that you are at work in our lives. Amen. Thanks again for joining us at Virtual Church. It's Wednesday today. We're going to be opening up St Andrew's Church between 1 o'clock and 5 o'clock this afternoon, and tomorrow St Michael's will also be open for private prayer and reflection between 10 a.m. and 12. So I hope you might be able to make it to those. God bless.